speaker today for our science series. My name is Lisa Marsh. I'm a professor here at Dartmouth in the medical school, and I have the privilege of heading up the Northeast node of the National Drug Abuse Treatment Clinical Trials Network. As folks may know, this is a national research infrastructure where we get to work with community partners to develop and conduct studies that address some of the most timely and significant challenges around substance use disorder treatment in our communities, and work with community partners to really disseminate the most evidence-based practices in real-world settings. And so we have a great privilege to be part of this network. Ours is the Northeast node, and as folks may know, we host a science series through our node. And I'm really excited to introduce our speaker today. We are really honored to have Dr. Joshua Lee here today, who is an associate professor of population health and medicine in general internal medicine and clinical innovation at the New York University School of Medicine. He's also the director of the New York University Fellowship in Addiction Medicine, and he is absolutely one of the world-renowned experts in testing models of screening and treatment for substance use disorder, and with a heavy focus on opioid use disorder, among other substances, in the justice system, and has done many, many studies, and we'll hear an overview of his work today and what we've learned from this line of research that really can transform how we think about offering evidence-based medical care to folks struggling with substance use disorders in justice settings. He's worked a lot on addiction pharmacotherapies, both in primary care as well as in criminal justice populations, and has been funded by the National Institutes of Health, including the National Institute on Drug Abuse, to look at clinical trials, looking at different pharmacotherapies, including naltrexone and buprenorphine for opioid and alcohol treatments in community, criminal justice involved adults at release from jail, and also within community primary care settings. And many of us, including our communities here in the Northeast, are really seeking to understand what can constitute best practices in the care we do in the justice system. And so we're really excited to learn from him about the state of the science of this and best practices in medicine. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Josh.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. Were there other slides we had to go through, or does it go right into mine? No problem.
Just really quickly, for those of you who seek continuing education credits, this session does offer them for medical professionals, mental health professionals, alcohol and drug counselors, and for social workers. So for the CMEs, they're offered through the Dartmouth Hitchcock Center for Learning and Professional Development. If you already have an account, please text the code MPVD to the login number, or set it up in your account online. If you need this code after just a second, please feel free to email me and I will get it to you. For CEU credits for clinical professionals, please email me, Bethany, to get us a copy of your certificate for attending today's live session. And then we have nothing to disclose for the science series as a whole. This presentation itself, Dr. Lee will disclose his anything that he needs.
Great, thanks for the invite. We've worked on a grant recently together, and I was just meeting with folks from New Hampshire Department of Corrections. So there's a whole world opening up in justice opiate stuff, thanks to new, basically, congressional funding of NIH and all this HEAL stuff, and a lot of that's going to flow into justice. So it's a very exciting time for jails and prisons. It's time to really kind of do something that hasn't really been done at scale yet, which is to get more medications to those types of populations. And that's a lot of what we've been working on over the years. So I'm at NYU. You can get at me on Twitter, and that's my email for any stuff or copies of slides, blah, blah, blah. My disclosures are the grants with a recent Indivior grant. So that's commercial. Indivior is a manufacturer of Sublocade and Suboxone. We're doing a survey study with some partners at Friends Research Institute in Baltimore, looking at the use of kind of Suboxone and buprenorphine products in prisons and jails. And then we take free drug whenever we can get it for these federal trials, like most clinical trials. So that's also part of the disclosure. And then a little bit of consulting for some early stage companies that are interested in the opiate space. As I was saying, things are kind of changing faster than ever. maybe not fast enough given how brutal the opiate, overdose epidemic has been. But we're seeing stuff happen through funding, through kind of recognition of the kind of most evidence-based way forward, and also lawsuits. In corrections, it's not unusual for large kind of policy shifts to be driven by lawsuits, and we'll see if this recent ruling, the ACLU versus Massachusetts, which was prompted by, I believe it was a female prisoner who was unable to continue on methadone during incarceration. And the ACLU said that's discrimination, that's cruel and unusual, and it's in violation of the American Disabilities Act. And that was a successful suit. We're going to see, what that does in terms of case law and then filtering out into practice. And then Massachusetts and more recently Maryland started to sign statewide legislation that's mandating the availability of most medications for opiate use disorders, methadone, buprenorphine, naltrexone, in local county, city-county jails, and then also in the state system. And so, that's not going to happen in every state around the country, but that's also, an example of things changing kind of quite dramatically from the standpoint of we've known we have stuff that works, but in corrections, it's often been a little delayed in terms of uptake, and then maybe it's kind of siloed, divorced, and the systems don't talk to each other. And what we do in primary care doesn't have anything to do with what happened in the jail, and what happens with opiate users isn't well treated in the jail, and it's certainly not taken care of in primary care. That's been kind of the status quo for a long time in a lot of places, and of course, that's not, hugely constructive if we can start to combine stuff and think about medical homes, think about kind of panel and team management, think of all the kind of stuff that's been going on really since like ACA in terms of primary care and behavioral health primary care kind of fusion. That can also apply to opiate use disorder treatment, and of course can apply to people in and out of the criminal justice system. All of which kind of have common needs and goals, and the treatments are all kind of the same. And that's, kind of been what we've worked for a long time. And then the other thing is I'm a primary care doctor. I've never worked in a specialty treatment setting, although I have worked on our detox unit at Bellevue Hospital in New York City, big public hospital. So that's a specialty treatment setting, but I don't do intensive outpatient drug treatment, and I don't work in a methadone clinic. I haven't worked in a 28-day rehab. I'm sitting mostly in primary care, or I've been a moonlighter in my jail system in New York City. But there's only so many resources. There's only so much staff. There's only so much kind of contact hours. And the less intense things are, this is just kind of a basic statement of fact, the more of it you can kind of produce or consume. And that probably has, a principle you can apply to drug treatment and opiate use disorder treatment when it comes to the use of medications. How simple can we make it? And can we then get these treatments out to as many people as possible at the lowest amount of cost? We started a clinic in Bellevue Hospital around 2006. I simply was born in the right year, 1972, so that when I graduated med school in 99, and then residency in internal medicine in 2002, that's exactly when buprenorphine was first approved in the United States. It also was when we kind of realized we had a real pill epidemic that was transitioning to a heroin problem. And then in a city like New York, we've always had heroin. We've had kind of an inner city heroin epidemic for literally like a century. And we started up a clinic in primary care, as many places were doing, with office-based opiate treatment using buprenorphine. Later on, we would start to incorporate naltrexone. But in primary care, everything kind of changed in the 2000s regarding opiate treatment, because you suddenly had a medication that you could prescribe, whereas before that, you couldn't do methadone. In our clinic, though, we were only going to be there so many hours a week, and we didn't have any staff or nurses or social workers or anything like that, all of which would have been great, but we just didn't have it. And we also looked at kind of like the SAMHSA, how do you treat people with buprenorphine regulations? They were pretty stiff, they're pretty conservative, and they were pretty kind of like go slow and essentially don't treat too many people too fast. for whatever reason, but that's how kind of the guidelines read circa 2005. We did something with our clinic where we just started writing prescriptions, and we hoped that someone could start buprenorphine safely on their own at home after seeing me, but not in front of my face. And that was a little different than how we had coached people on how to start buprenorphine up till that point. We published on this. We kind of invented this now rapidly out of date kind of pictogram-based how to take buprenorphine thing. We still use this today, but we're too lazy to update it. It's really based on kind of the old Suboxone film, which if you remember was shaped in this hexagonal thing. Anyway, it's kind of, hey, Billy, this is how you take buprenorphine. Call me if there's a problem. And we've been doing that in primary care in a public hospital, which has medication if you don't have insurance. So that's great. We can treat you pretty much no matter what. If you can show up and register at the front desk, you can start buprenorphine that day out of our hospital pharmacy. More and more, though, post-Obamacare, everybody in New York State, which is a huge Medicaid expansion state, is Medicaid eligible already, has Medicaid, and that's even easier. And now you're going to go out to Walgreens and get your medication, and then come back in a week and tell us how it goes. If you want to do more counseling, that's awesome. If you want to go to 6 AA meetings this week, we salute you. But we can't mandate, require, or even really monitor very closely all the other psychosocial stuff that really could be helpful to a lot of people. But in this case, we call it kind of low threshold and kind of low barrier or low intensity, because none of that is really part of the package. At the basis, people are just seeing us on a weekly basis for buprenorphine, and then it gets very quickly to monthly visits, and we write the prescription, and we test your urine, and we try and provide good care and make sure you're doing well in treatment, but that's really about it. That's gotten us this over about 7 or 8 years. This is a paper we wrote a few years ago that looked at 7 years worth of data. Not everyone had been in the clinic 7 years, but some people had. This is a survival curve that's really just retention in treatment. And it's contrasting folks that came in totally new and needed to be inducted. That's the red line. They stayed with us an average of 38 weeks. That's pretty good. It's not awesome. It's about how a lot of these office-based buprenorphine clinic survival papers line up. People stay in treatment on average, so every 1 in 2 patients, about half a year to a year. If you already came in on buprenorphine, that's the blue line, you did even better, and you would stay with us for a full kind of 2 years on average, 110 weeks. But then interestingly, buprenorphine is simple, it's a powerful opiate. People kind of feel generally well, better, normal on it when they're doing well in treatment, but it's hard to come off of. It's an opiate like any other. It has opiate withdrawal, and you have to kind of carefully get off it, which can be too much for some people, even if they want to, and then for others, it's not something they want, and they want to just stay on it long term. In our clinic, the green line sums up everybody. That's just kind of combining the red and blue lines. We've had this cohort of patients now with us for over a decade now in our treatment. So in this graph, about 15 to 20% of people were making it out. It's still in our clinic, coming back for refills periodically for years and years and years, and that's without much other help from us. So it's really kind of showing that not everybody does that, not everybody wants to do it, but a substantial proportion of anybody walking into this kind of underserved primary-based clinic would translate into, kind of a decade-long treatment episode without much more than me kind of refilling your prescription once they're in our clinic that long, it can get to we'll see you every 12 to 16 weeks. We can give refills in New York State with buprenorphine products or Schedule III controlled substances, so that's pretty routine. It's not everybody, and it's certainly not everybody when we talk about corrections, but in just terms of the great pool of opiate use disorder patients, some people really just need access to these medications, and they get it, they can take it, they can figure it out on their own, and they don't really need a ton more from us that we can tell. That's often written up in clinical trials as medical management, and that's kind of the psychosocial basis of most of what we've done in all the trials I'm talking about today. It's really just like, here's the medication that's indicated for your condition. It's good. It'll help you. You'll do a lot better. You'll live a lot longer. Your diabetes will be better controlled. Your blood pressure will be lower. You won't have a stroke. You won't use as much heroin, inject as much, or die of overdose. And you can combine it with all the medications we have, less so with methadone. We don't think of methadone plus med management because with methadone, you're stuck for the most part going to an opiate treatment program. That's a totally, different kind of treatment modality, and you can't really get around that for the regs. But with naltrexone and buprenorphine, you can contrast med management, which is kind of the basics, with more intensive stuff. And I'm not going to go through this, but one interesting part of the opiate literature over the last 15 years has been that adding a lot of counseling, and the clinical trial notes done some of these studies, to basic office-based buprenorphine, for instance, it doesn't generate a ton more in terms of the basic opiate outcomes, retention and treatment, lack of heroin use, safety, all that kind of stuff. So some people probably really get something out of more counseling on top of the office-based treatment, but it's hard to predict who that is. And on average, the office-based medical management crew does pretty good, and it's hard to improve on that if you're looking at some of the bread and butter outcomes that we usually look at in these studies. Here's a study. I'll let you go through the author list and see when I first met Lisa Marsh. This was the first time we had ever used buprenorphine in New York City jails. And it was also a pretty simple model. We had this experience where we, not really we, I don't represent the New York City jail system. I don't work for the city of New York, but I've been a moonlighter in that system for many years, and I've done studies like this sitting over at NYU. But the jail system was very interested in buprenorphine, in addition to what we already had in New York, which was decades of experience with methadone. It's an unusual jail system in that it's huge, and it's had methadone since 1987, and in a big way. Literally thousands of New Yorkers every year individually get methadone for detox, for maintenance. They continue on their methadone maintenance, and they get started as new methadone maintenance patients in New York City jails. And then when they leave, they go to our many and kind of vast methadone clinic network throughout the 5 boroughs of New York City. One of the only places you can do it because you have all this community-based methadone available in New York City, which has always kind of been the capital of methadone treatment for the United States. And so the jail can then send literally hundreds of people a month out to these clinics, and that works because there's enough spots for them. But buprenorphine was a new thing around 2006, I think, when this kicked off. It was led by Steve Bergura, who had been at NDRI, a research institute in New York, where Lisa was at the time. I was over at Bellevue, New York City, and then I kind of joined up with this study. They wanted to see how it went, and they had initially piloted buprenorphine in about 50 patients, and it worked well in jail. People wanted it. There was a little bit of kind of street cred and knowledge about it even then, even though it wasn't a ton, and nothing like it is today where everybody knows about it. But they referred you only to one place, and that was a program in Brooklyn that was an intensive outpatient program. That's where you had to go to stay on buprenorphine if they had started you on it afresh at Rikers Island. And what happened was people would go there and they'd be like, I'm here for my bup. And the program would say, excellent, it's going to be 25 hours of counseling over the next week, and you have to keep doing that week after week. Basically, you have to sign up for a kind of 90-day intensive outpatient dose, which is typical of intensive outpatient licensed drug treatment in New York State. It's like that everywhere. It's kind of the program you're signing up for. And that was how you were going to get buprenorphine, and literally 0 out of 50 people stuck with it. So for this study, we were trying to send people out to more places, including our new clinic at Bellevue Hospital, where we didn't have those requirements, and we really were just trying to keep people on the medication as best we could with limited resources. What we found in that study, which was a smallish to medium-sized pilot, was that buprenorphine was pretty popular. People were asked at arrest when they come in, often immediately post-heroin and in withdrawal. We then start everybody on methadone at Rikers Island for at least 6 days. You get a little taper, so you're not in florid withdrawal when you're sitting there. And during those first few days, we would ask people if they wanted to be part of a study where they'd either stay on methadone or they would switch to this new thing. In that case, it was Suboxone tablets. And enough people signed up for it. And then through release, there was a slightly higher rate of people staying on that for the next like 30 to 45 days, which was about the average time they then spent in jail, either pre-trial detention or they were already sentenced and were serving a brief city sentence. So that was interesting. That looked like slightly better, though not whoppingly so, versus methadone. And then who would go to a first appointment when they got out? It was a much higher number for buprenorphine, and that was quite interesting. It was a little lower than we suspected it would be for methadone, and it was pretty good for buprenorphine. But as you can see, 48% versus 23%, the majority of people in this trial didn't go to their first appointment after release to stay on either one of these medications. And that's a kind of reminder of how challenging it can be. And then I didn't complete the slide. I apologize. I meant to come back to this. This was supposed to show 3 to 6 months later. There wasn't a significant difference, and it was an even lower rate of people still in treatment, say, at 6 months later. And that's, you'll see that in correctional studies. With methadone, then with buprenorphine, and now with some naltrexone stuff I'll show you. It's really hard to keep a majority of people engaged over the next kind of 6, 9, 12 months. And it's a reminder how when I walk into treatment as a heroin user, but I walk into Bellevue Hospital, I say I'm here for my appointment that I did enough work to get, I'm ready to start Suboxone, say. That's how I treat people on Tuesday morning most weeks, and we'll get a handful of those patients each week. That person is probably much more capable and ready and not so ambivalent, like they're there because they mean to be there, versus catching people when they get arrested. Hey man, you want to be in a clinical trial? We're going to start you on a drug and you've never heard of it, in this case, it's Suboxone, or you'll be on methadone. It sounded good at the time, but that didn't predict necessarily for everybody what they're going to be up to 12 months from now. And that's just something to keep in mind with correctional health service research in general. How we recruit, what kind of understanding people have at baseline, and then how little relationship that has to how they're going to do when they get back out, because there's so many other factors and challenges that come into play. It's a lot different than just starting someone on treatment in primary care who voluntarily walked in the door. When they did get to our clinic, this is kind of our new Suboxone clinic, circa 2007. We had at Bellevue Hospital. We compared in this paper folks who had come from jail versus folks who had come from any other referral. And it turned out to be the same population. There was no difference if you were a jail referral versus if you were from my detox unit or if you were from another rehab that would refer you to me to continue buprenorphine, those kind of other referrals we were getting. Where my cousin's in your program, I want to be in your program, we get those referrals all the time. The same retention, that's contrasting jail referrals to any other community referral. The same rate of opiate positive urine, so people in treatment but still, chipping or using the same self-report, which is always a little lower than the actual urine positive rate in our clinic. That's an interesting topic, but I won't say much more about it. But it didn't matter. It was the same. If you came from the homeless shelter or the jail or Bellevue Hospital, which is not, Sloan Kettering, it's a big public hospital for poor people. Basically, it was all kind of poor heroin users who had a lot of high needs and yet were able to kind of get into this clinic. And so then, when we started you in jail, we could keep 80% of you on buprenorphine until the end of release. And then that dropped down to about 43%, I think it was, coming to this clinic visit. Then things smoothed out a lot. So if you can get to that first couple visits, you're kind of proving yourself, I think, as someone, highly motivated, organized, can remember where to go at what time. All that kind of stuff has to happen. This clinic is not just like a walk-in urgent care kind of stuff. So that it seems to be a survival curve, kind of like we see in clinic. Like initially there's more drop off and then people kind of figure out that they want to stay in it and the rate of decay starts to slow down. Just wanted to highlight this. it's kind of a historical article, and it shows some of the same dynamics. I wasn't part of the study. This was the first ever NIDA-funded, really well done analysis of methadone in a jail or prison, and then outcomes post-release. This was an opportunity afforded only in New York City, because New York City at that point, this was published in '93, so they're doing the study kind of the late '80s into the '90s. The methadone clinic started in 1987 in New York City jails, so it was really a response to the HIV, multi-drug resistant TB epidemic that New York was getting hammered by at that point, and that was pre-HART, so there wasn't much to do for the HIV. And it was a real crisis within injectors, and jail with methadone was a way to tackle all those problems, help the opiate stuff, help the injections, and help the HIV outcomes. So they had this then, and it was the same guy, Steve Magura from NDRI. And then historical note, Herman Joseph was on this. He's on a lot of old methadone papers. He just died. He was a really funny guy and an unusual kind of cranky sort. I only met him kind of late with this paper that Lisa and I were on. Herman was still, going strong with that kind of stuff, but he was part of his research as well. So you've never heard of Herman Joseph, but now you have, and R.I.P. Herman. Anyway, they were looking at a difference here, and this is back to kind of the ACLU lawsuit. If you come in on methadone at arrest, you're much more likely to show at clinic after release. And that makes sense than if someone just started fresh on methadone during that jail episode. So kind of new to methadone, already on methadone is the contrast in this table. And the rates are generally higher for showing at clinic. And then if you showed, did you stay in for a month? And then if you showed, were you in there for 5 months? So there's some loss in both these groups. It's not 100% retention across this long time. But the folks who come in on methadone generally want to stay on methadone and leave on methadone. And we've seen that in other studies. That was not the case in this, buprenorphine trial. These were all people kind of new to either methadone or buprenorphine, not on one of the two at arrest, versus this study where a substantial portion of people were already on methadone. And so when you do MAT in a jail or prison, there's two populations you're really targeting. One, of course, is you're about to die of an overdose, you're not in treatment, here you are in jail, let's prevent, all these bad outcomes by starting treatment. That's obviously crucial, but that's also the hardest population to treat. And there's not a guarantee, as I'm showing in these slides, that many of those people wind up in treatment 6 months later. But the people already on bup or methadone, and we might extend this, although we haven't really seen these studies in naltrexone, they're already on something that they have some commitment to and in some way like. The arrest probably didn't directly occur because of the methadone. They were on methadone, that was a good thing. They got arrested because of all the other reasons people got arrested. They're using cocaine, they have no money, they shoplift, they have a long track record, so anytime they see the police, they get thrown in jail. All that kind of stuff happens in New York City all the time. But if you then continue them on methadone, good, and if you have them leave then after a short city incarceration period, they generally go back to that clinic. And that was, again, the basis of the ADA lawsuit in Massachusetts. Somebody was already on methadone, then they're locked up. All of a sudden they have to come off it. That makes no sense medically, and it doesn't make any sense medically. But if there's no methadone in that facility, they're not going to be able to continue on methadone. Just more context of how incarceration works and kind of drugs and alcohol in New York City. These are slides I stole from John Giftos, who is leading the opiate treatment program. He's a physician and a kind of a dynamic guy on Twitter. He's really a good Twitter follow if you like opiate Twitter. John Giftos, MD. And he gives great talks, and he's really kind of revamped everything going on at Rikers Island in regards to opiate treatment. Not that it was low-key and unsatisfactory before, but now it's really dynamic and I think even more of a model. This was contrasting the jail in general. Heroin certainly isn't the only problem. Cocaine versus speed and crank and methamphetamine. New York is still like a crack City, and some powdered cocaine, but a lot of inhaled cocaine compared to other stimulants. But this was contrasting overall, who's just everyone that came into the jail this year versus the entry point for most men. This is the kind of the intake building for most of the men. And this, you see the rates for these kind of fresh arrestees goes up. And then for this, they wrote a paper looking at the frequently incarcerated. That's kind of like the chronically institutionalized jail, detox hospital, you know, rehab, and then they do the circuit again. These are like the most costly patients in your state in terms of Medicaid and criminal justice funds. And there the rates, you know, for all these things are even higher. Although for heroin, it goes down a little. There you can see kind of the importance of cocaine and alcohol as well. And then just to give you some fresh stats from New York City jails, this is kind of the volume of methadone and buprenorphine in fiscal year 2018. Those are individual patients out of about 40 to 50,000 individual admissions over that same fiscal year. So it's big. It's probably like by far the biggest jail-based, you know, methadone thing going on in the country for many years now. And I think with 500 plus people on buprenorphine, that would probably be the largest criminal justice buprenorphine program, if you want to call it that, in the country, although other places maybe have exceeded that by now. All right, those are the crib slides from John. Advance, advance.
Apparently, we're having a trouble with Zoom today. Keep getting a little spinning wheel of death behind your presentation.
There we go. Well, this will work. So now I'll wrap up. Well, we're not quite wrapping up, but I won't talk much longer. I'm going to go into some naltrexone studies. Naltrexone, totally different than our friends buprenorphine and methadone. I think I'll just leave that up for now, or
You want me to get rid of it?
I don't know, whatever you want to do.
If you want to talk while I work, go for it.
Yeah, everyone's probably heard of this, but naltrexone is a non-narcotic. It's an opiate antagonist. So at the same opiate receptor where heroin, oxycodone, methadone, buprenorphine do all this stuff, it goes there. It also has tremendous stickiness or kind of binding affinity, but it doesn't do anything. Chemically, it's an antagonist, meaning it kind of stops any activity at that same kind of circuit point, and so there's no downstream kind of opiate plus going on. There's not a lot of opiate negative, like if you go into naltrexone, you're not suddenly in pain, but it means nothing else is going to get into the opiate receptor. Injection of naltrexone. So if you got to coach patients on avoiding painful events, if they have surgery upcoming, this is not the drug for them. If they're chronic pain patients who really think they need to be on Ultrium and a little bit of Percocet, even though they have an addiction problem, they shouldn't be on naltrexone. Otherwise, it's pretty well tolerated once you get it going. As I'll talk about in some of our work, and as we just know in clinical care, it's hard to start people who are actively using opiates because they have to detox first. And it's hard to detox people as outpatients or even sometimes as inpatients at high enough rates to get everybody on the medication. The first stuff we ever did with naltrexone, though, was actually an alcohol study. Just a reminder that we use it for alcohol. This was another primary care, simple, see doctor, get medicine, go home, call us if there's a problem, come back, you know, drink as little as possible. But we're really just going to support you through a baseline visit. Then we'll see you back. We'll inject you. You get the first injection. We'll have you back, I think 1 week after that, just to make sure everything's okay. And then after that, it's monthly visits, and you get the injection every month. Not everyone sticks with it. This is showing the kind of rate of people staying on monthly injections. By the third injection, it was down to 56%. That's kind of in the eye of the beholder, whether that's good or bad. People that did stay on it, this is showing drinking outcomes over time. Their daily drinking, their percentage of heavy drinking, their percentage of abstinence, all that started to improve. And so people that stick with it start to look better and better in terms of drinking. That's not the same as saying everybody that got it in the first place had controlled drinking at, say, 90 days later. But in this kind of observational study, you're stuck with only the people who are coming back to see you, who happen to be the people who like the treatment the most and are staying on it. So single arm, observational, no control here. but it looked like a pretty feasible thing to use in primary care. And ever since then, we've had, of course, oral naltrexone as well as injectable naltrexone in our clinic for alcohol. And that's the first time I had ever started using it at scale. In some of the same years, this paper came out in 2016. So, for the 6-7 years before that, we were preparing for and conducting this study, which after the Russian study of opiate use treatment for Vivitrol, this was the largest US randomized trial ever of extended-release naltrexone. It was open label. It randomized people to naltrexone versus no medication. It was for people who said at baseline, I'm not about to or very interested in methadone or buprenorphine. And for the most part, people were not using heroin or other opiates at baseline, and they were able to rapidly start medication. So it was real kind of a relapse prevention thing. And then it happened to focus on criminal justice. It was geared up to kind of look at the criminal justice community dwelling population, so parole, probation, drug court, or we actually loosely defined it as having been incarcerated in the last 12 months. So you weren't on community supervision, but you had been kind of in and out of a correctional system recently. And that's the population we recruited for this. It made a difference in terms of relapse-free survival to be on naltrexone versus not on medication. Interestingly, this many people survived, though, on nothing and did fine and didn't have a relapse event, which we defined as a couple consecutive weeks worth of heroin use or positive urines. But there was a difference, and it was significant, and that was kind of the treatment effect in this sample of naltrexone. In that study, it was 6 months of medications, and it was early days for the Vivitrol product, and there wasn't a lot of reimbursement or availability, so most people did that 6 months and then stopped naltrexone. We followed them, though, for an additional 6 and 12 months after that. So we wound up generating the initial 6-month treatment phase, but then also, and this is in the publication, we looked at people, so kind of on medication, almost everyone now, if they made it this far on 6 months of naltrexone stops. And then this is looking at urines positive for opiates. So it's an advantage to be on naltrexone. Less people are using, but as people quit, they go back to using. That's why this starts to go up during the treatment phase. But then 6 months after that, they really converged, and 12 months after that, you're talking about the same group of people, which is like whatever we did for that first 6 months is kind of gone by 18 months. And that made sense. So it's like, we don't think naltrexone cures you, and if you're not on it and you're sitting around in a neighborhood with a lot of heroin and your buddy still uses, you're very likely to eventually go back to using. Not everyone is going to. So this same treatment as usual, and then it became the treatment arm. About half the people are able to kind of not do that, but then about half the people in each group 18 months later had started using again. And we think that kind of applies to all the medications that we're using for opiate treatment disorder. If I quit methadone 12 months later, I don't expect to see a lot of great effects from the previous methadone treatment, and that's certainly what we've seen in other studies of buprenorphine. On treatment, good. Off treatment, not so good. So it really is kind of a chronic proposition, and it's not something we're going to fix with 6 months of treatment. The first jail naltrexone study we ever did was this one. It was a small pilot. It was funded by like some NYU grants, and then Alkermes itself gave us a study grant. So there is some commercial bias for sure in this one, and there was no NIH funding in this study. But we looked at people about to leave Rikers Island who are not on opiates. So that's the blue thing. These are individual patients. Week 0/1 in this slide is you're sitting in jail. You're about to leave, but at arrest, you had been using heroin, and we can look in the medical record and see that you had gotten methadone at arrest. So we were pretty reliably sure we were recruiting the right people with opiate use disorder who were probably going to go back out and use. Right here, you got a shot of extended-release naltrexone. Here, you were this was literally the week you leave, you were not interested or on methadone or buprenorphine. So there wasn't really time to put you on those medications, and the people were explicitly kind of signing a document that said, that's not what I'm doing anyway. And we had, although we had a lot of methadone and buprenorphine in New York City jails, This was not uncommon. About a third of people were still leaving off MAT, either through exclusion criteria, like you can't be on methadone for this, that, or the other reason, or because they didn't want it, or because something had fallen through and they had never been called to clinic, and whatever happened, we had a large volume of people still just kind of walking out and probably returning to heroin use, which is what happens in a red square. It means you came to clinic and your urine was positive for heroin. That's kind of the natural history of heroin users leaving jail in New York City. Most of them go back to using heroin. They weren't asking to be arrested. They weren't really signing up for treatment when they got arrested. They sat there without getting much treatment during incarceration. Lo and behold, they're back using drugs and alcohol, in this case heroin, when they leave. Makes total sense. But it did seem to make a difference in this very small study. It was randomized, but it's still extremely small, 34 people. You got more abstinence, more lack of heroin use, so relapse-free survival if you had gotten the active medication. In this study, everyone here got a dose, and then at week 4, we would try and give you another dose, and half the people were around and interested to get a second dose. So already we'd had kind of a drop-off of half the sample. Even though we're doing better here, not everybody is like feeling the love or sticking with it. Based on that pilot data, we of course wrote an even bigger grant, and we got it, yay. And this was a NIDA study we are just kind of wrapping up. We still have a handful of people in 6-month follow-up, 2 guys, and then we have added extensive 1- and 2-year follow-up thanks to some supplemental funding. But it's really a 6-month trial like the other ones I was showing you, where you're sitting around about to leave New York City jail, you're not on Bupror or methadone, you're not particularly interested in those things. That becomes a randomized trial of naltrexone 1-to-1 versus no medication, but a little bit more counseling and referrals. I'm sorry, we call that enhanced treatment as usual versus naltrexone. We also, though, recruited people who were starting methadone just to kind of put naltrexone in the context of this well-established methadone treatment protocol in the same facilities. We were a little underpowered so far. We were trying to recruit 85 per arm, and things got really slow, rough, lack of the percent of people that met criteria of sitting around not on maintenance started to shrink and shrink, and our jail population in New York has gone down steadily, really year to year over the last like 15 years, which is great for the city of New York. Bad for this study, but that's just how it went down. At the same time, NIDA took our grant, which we just sent in as a regular R1 submission, but they combined it with 2 others in a really cool way with a study that went on in Albuquerque. There was naltrexone plus or minus patient navigator. We didn't have that in the New York study, patient navigation, but that would be something you might think of, right? Like a recovery coach or a sober coach or a case manager. You know, patient navigator can mean a lot of different things, but it's really just someone who has minimal training, usually has recovery experience themselves, and is though able and trained up to help you get your Medicaid, go to your appointments, go to other groups and other treatments, and really kind of to encourage you to access all the services you need and stay on the medication. And then in Baltimore, the city jail didn't have methadone for new patients. They've continued old patients on it for a while, but starting people on methadone was a new thing in Baltimore, which is a huge, heroin town, and could really use that type of stuff. And so in Baltimore, they were studying what they call interim methadone, where we're just starting you on methadone. We don't have you in really a wraparound program yet. We call that interim, kind of like some of the Vermont studies of interim buprenorphine and methadone, same thing. Plus or minus patient navigation. So we all kind of worked on these together. We tried to get outcomes that would link up between all the studies, some of the interventions, patient navigation, and treatment as usual, and between Albuquerque and New York, naltrexone were shared. So we're hoping eventually to combine a lot of this data into kind of a 3-study analysis. But what I'm talking about in New York, these slides got a little out of order, I apologize. So I'll skip this one, which is kind of a lot of the press that Viviral generated, which hasn't been great, and is really kind of focused on their marketing to criminal justice as a kind of controversial and potentially unethical kind of maneuver for a corporation. But it also describes why Vivitrol has really kind of grown substantially in criminal justice, in part because of corporate behavior. In our New York study, most people got it in jail, and then we saw almost the exact same thing we saw in the pilot. About half the people continued on it, and then things continued to decline, but in a kind of steadier way, so that at the end of the study we just wrapped up, about a quarter of people had gotten all 6 months worth of medication. When we've looked at urine, so I'm not presenting final stuff, but we do want to start talking about this study. We've been working on it too long, and we've kind of felt the pressure to get stuff out. And then this is, again, looking at urine grids, where there's not an overwhelming difference. You might say there's a little more blue in the naltrexone arm, enhanced treatment as usual, naltrexone, and then methadone on the right. And then here's another way of looking at it, just focusing on the randomized trial. And then we started to count up these blocks, and we're coming up with a higher rate of negative urines if you got the naltrexone, but it's not an overwhelming slam dunk like, you know, every single person that got it did a lot better or anything like that. There's a lot of missingness. There's a lot of folks, as we saw from the decline in injection rates, that you just lose and don't come back, and then they can't accrue negative urines. You know, they can't get the good outcome in this study, and that's just kind of how it went down. So it's probably going to wind up, we'll have final kind of results within the next couple months. It's kind of going to wind up being a kind of like mildly positive intervention, but not a kind of overwhelmingly amazing treatment effect that we may have predicted a little bit more of at the beginning. And then just to wrap things up, this was not a criminal justice focused thing. It was a big national head-to-head study of extended-release naltrexone versus buprenorphine. It was called the XPOT study. Phoebe there, her and I worked on it for many years. And I bring it up now because it incorporated a lot of what we were talking about in terms of med management. This was a big NIDA study at 8 sites. The closest one to here was Fall River, Massachusetts. The STAR, I don't know if you know Jeannie Bailey down there. She was the site PI. And then we did it at Bellevue Hospital in New York. We did it out at Tarzana in LA, RC Casey's in Evergreen in Seattle, a treatment center in Jacksonville, Florida, Columbus, Ohio, and Albuquerque, New Mexico. So it was a big kind of national thing. 570 people came in, mostly male, white, unemployed IV heroin users. Not exclusively, but those were like the most common demographics in drug use history. And then there was a lower rate of induction. It was harder on these detox units to actually get somebody onto naltrexone, because we would randomize you potentially very early on, like right when you got to the detox unit, but you came in using heroin and you still had to do your detox, and people wouldn't get through that, or they get bored. We actually put in some rules and regs where you had to wait a certain amount of time for a negative urine before you could give them any naltrexone, and people wouldn't wait around that long. So we had all sorts of kind of ins and outs and difficulties getting everyone on naltrexone versus buprenorphine, where pretty much the only people that didn't get on buprenorphine just decided against it themselves. But there's no like technical or wait time difficulty putting anybody on buprenorphine on a detox unit. You can pretty much do it immediately or within 24 hours. If you didn't get on naltrexone, you had a higher rate of early relapse. And that's what this curve is showing. We started counting a relapse outcome. Similar to the other studies, relapse in this was the primary outcome, and it meant like 2 to 4 weeks of consecutive heroin use per your urine or your self-report, or you stopped showing up. All that could contribute to a relapse event. This was mostly people who had never started naltrexone in the first place, and they didn't look so great, or they were gone by kind of week 4, 5, 6 of the study. And so the relapse event would occur early. Then the curves kind of have an equal slope, but naltrexone never quite catches back up. So at the end of the study, it was a 6-month treatment phase again. There's a slightly higher rate of relapse-free survival in the buprenorphine arm. So in that sense, because of this early gap, buprenorphine won and was better overall head-to-head at keeping people relapse-free over 6 months. When we looked at everyone who had started at least one dose of either medication, you can see, again, what induction failure. So I didn't get on the meds, and you get these curves, or we put everyone on the meds, and then the curves look exactly the same. That was an interesting thing that we were a little surprised at how similar it looked. These are very different medications. Once a month naltrexone, you're not on an opiate. You're getting a shot in the butt once a month. Buprenorphine, in this case, sublingual buprenorphine film. We're using Suboxone film. You know, you take that once a week. Some people, you had to come in for refills more than once a month. We didn't require, we offered, but didn't require intensive psychosocial treatment as part of the study. So at the minimum, you had to come to kind of prescribing visits for the buprenorphine or injection visits for the naltrexone. And that was back to kind of the medical management office-based platform. It was applied in this study, much like we had piloted in all that earlier work. XBOT, this paper came out about a year ago, year and a half now, it's been interesting. I think people have been very interested in it. Looking at people in treatment, the other interesting findings were that craving was rated about the same. It went down a little bit, a tick lower for naltrexone early on, and then kind of equalized. So both drugs, you know, mechanically they're very different, and biologically, you know, you would feel different on naltrexone versus buprenorphine. Just they're total opposites, and yet they both treat cravings. People feel treated and kind of safe when they're on both, and they have less urge to use heroin, and that's kind of what comes out when you ask a craving rating item. Depressive systems, we're doing the HAM-D, and people just rated their kind of mood as about equal on both. They have higher symptoms at baseline, and those kind of gradually look a bit better. There had been a kind of theory in the press and in some, you'll hear at conferences, that when you go on naltrexone, you're bummed out. We just like clamp down your opiate system. How can you feel any pleasure, you know, from the birds outside or the ham sandwich? Like, just life sucks, right? You're on naltrexone. Your endorphins can't get in there and do anything good, so you'll be depressed. That wasn't the case in this study. And the cognitive function we wanted to show for buprenorphine, being on opiate maintenance doesn't mean you can't use a computer or, you know, do the crossword puzzle. And cognitive function through some pretty simple calculation attention tests, Trails AB and the Stroop, were the same scores no matter the drug. So there it looked fine to be on an agonist versus an antagonist. And then we tried to carefully track overdose events, as well as all the other safety features. What we came up with was there was a greater percent of patients had an overdose with naltrexone versus buprenorphine. That wasn't significant, but it's, you know, 15 is higher than 8. If you looked at the number of overdoses overall, some people, you know, the same person would have a couple overdoses. 18 was greater than 10. And the number of overdoses, though, among the people that got on a medication, 10 versus 9, was quite similar. And so it started to look like this. On study medication, you had the lowest rate when we calculated kind of the event rate over weeks at risk times the people, you know, blah, blah, blah. That was the lowest time. So independent of which medication, being on medication, lower overdose rate. Off medication, including not inducted, and that penalizes the naltrexone group more than the buprenorphine group. But either way, if you weren't on medication either from the start or eventually at the end, that was some of the highest overdose rates we saw. So this has been, you know, I think kind of reassuring and then also not completely satisfactory to the field. This study was not designed to track the impact on overdose rates. There aren't enough overdoses, if that's a polite way of putting it, in these one-off clinical trials, even a big multi-site study to look at differences. You need a large number of people, and that's why a lot of the overdose data comes from observational studies. Like we looked at 30,000 lives in Massachusetts, you know, they were on this, that, and the other medication, but then you're stuck with observational data, which lacks a lot of the prospective, you know, kind of randomization benefits that this one had. So at least though, in this data set, in a large number of people, it doesn't look like, for instance, naltrexone makes you super bummed out and then you stop it and then you immediately have an overdose and die. That's like been kind of a scenario that critics of the medication have painted. That doesn't seem to happen at, substantial rates that we were able to pick up in a study this size. Choice was one thing we thought about in this study. Everyone agreed to be in a randomized trial, and I could get either drug A or drug B. But we did ask people which one they would prefer to get. If they could flip the coin and make it land heads or tails, which one would they get? So about a third of people said, I do not care. About a third of people said, I hope I get Suboxone. And about a third of people said, I hope I get Vivitrol. Preferring one or the other didn't seem to make a big difference to who failed induction onto naltrexone, what your relapse rate was once you had started either medication. That was all kind of a wash. But it did seem to make a difference if you preferred naltrexone, you were hoping to get that out of the study, and then you were randomized to bupe. Probably just a higher number of people refused it. So there was that 6% of people that never got on bupe, and probably a lot of them were from that cell, people that initially were hoping, and then it turned out they were really hoping so much that they didn't agree to get randomized and then would refuse the buprenorphine. I'm going to skip that. We're pretty much out of time, right? The only other thing on the horizon, one thing Lisa and I and partners here in New Hampshire worked on recently was an application to do a big Sublocade study in criminal justice at multiple sites. Sublocade is extended release buprenorphine. It's the latest opiate product approved at the FDA. There's 2 companies that have an injectable, and only one of them so far has FDA approval. That's Indivior, who is the maker of originally the Suboxone tablet, then Suboxone film, and now this monthly injectable.